Welcome everyone to the Stoa. Today we'll be having the third of fourth philosopher in residence series with Robert Gilman. Really looking forward to this one. And the I think standard protocol for those who have been here before, and I'll just repeat just in case, where after a presentation from Robert, which will probably be about an hour, we'll open up to a Q&A. During the presentation, if you have any questions, I would strongly encourage you to share them into the chat and indicate that if you would like to not be on recording, which this recording will go on to the Stoa YouTube channel, indicate that you would like me to read it on your behalf. Otherwise, I would invite you to ask your question by unmuting. Yeah, I think without any further ado, I will hand it off to Robert to kick off another session.
Great. Thank you, David. Really delighted to be here and delighted to be doing this third event in this series. And let me get it going. Do the appropriate screen share. There we go. Can you see that okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Great, super. All right, well, one of the things I want to say before I just move this on just another step forward is that there will be PDFs. There'll be a PDF of the slides of this available. And there are PDFs now of the previous Stoa events that I've done that are both on the YouTube channel and on the context.org website. So I know that what I do often has a certain, shall we say, density to it. You don't need to necessarily take notes if that's what you have been doing. You can refer back to the PDF once we're all done. So I invite you to just let this wash over you and enjoy it. So let's get into it. This has been part of the this series of 3. I know we've got a 4th one coming, but the 3 presentation events focused on these 3 new capacities to deal with the dysfunctions in Age of Enlightenment modernist culture. The first one was savvy about psychodynamics. The next one was skillful with diverse modes of cognition. And this one is adept at the new strategy for success. So what do we mean? What do I mean by that? So I want to contrast 2 strategies. One that you'll be quite familiar with because it's been around for thousands of years, basically, is enforce the domination over self, others, and nature. And of course, I'll be going into that one a little bit more. And then I'm going to suggest that the new strategy that is emerging is to embody the harmony within, with others, and with nature. So it's a different kind of relationship with the same threesome of self, other, and nature. These are high-level maps of very complex territories. Let me do this sort of table to provide a little more of the contrast. With the domination strategy, success is essentially about winning power struggles. Whereas with the harmony strategy, success is about living the 3 harmonies, which may at times mean that you find yourself dealing with a power struggle, but you come out of it in a way that feels like you have achieved more than simply a win-lose win. The motivation. The core motivation for the domination strategy is essentially fear. And with the harmony strategy, it's much more love and creativity. In terms of how it fits into, I say, today's context, what do I mean by that? Today's culture, today's environment, the issues going on in the world, where we are in terms of our level of technology, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that the old domination strategy is declining in the degree to which it actually fits. Thousands of years ago, it fit very well, which is one of the reasons it shows up in so many parts of the world. The harmony one is rising. However, there's a lot of support for the domination strategy. We're all familiar with it. It's got a long history, and it's woven into our institutions in all kinds of ways. Whereas the harmony strategy doesn't really, it's new, and it doesn't have that kind of support. So its support is really about its relevance in the present and the future. If you get on board with it, you get the early adopter benefits, but you don't get the benefits of having all of that background behind you. And then I also want to relate these to when I talked about savvy for psychodynamics, I talked about the autonomic nervous system zones, and the domination strategy basically, well, let me just move on to look at those zones. So here's a chart that I had in the Savvy About Psychodynamics presentation that looks at what different areas of autonomic nervous system feel like. And when you're in an area with a strong sense of threat, then you get a high either sympathetic or dorsal vagus activation, fight, flight, or shutdown, and you're very much in your defensive zone there. But when you've got a strong sense of safety, then you wind up being in a flow state, in a place where you can really connect, place where you feel mellow, and what I like to describe as your optimal zone. It's the place where you not only can have fun, but you can also get things done. It's actually your most productive and most creative place to be. So the two strategies, the old strategy fits really well in the defensive zone, makes a lot of sense if you were coming from the defensive zone. The new strategy makes a lot of sense from the optimal zone. Okay, so let's look at each of these in a little more detail. So Enforce the Three Dominations has been all around the world for thousands of years. And just give you a little bit of a reminder, that's a warfare in China. The four people next to them are slaves in the Aztec Empire. And then you have the Roman Empire, and you have Egypt with slaves as well. Just a reminder, we all know it's been around for a long, long time. And it continues as a frequent strategy for worldly success in many cultures. Built on willpower, treats the other, whether it's the other person or the other in nature as other, as an exploitable object. Back to the distinction between objects and territories. And it works well in a loosely connected world where the feedback from what you're doing to the loser doesn't come around and hit you, where the karma is slow, is one way to put it. So in a loosely connected world, it actually fits pretty well. And it's one of the reasons why in so many cultures didn't necessarily start off that way, but they had, in effect, a vulnerability to slip into that mode. And once they slipped into that mode, they were pretty well stuck in it. Embody the three harmonies. I just want to point out that I did a previous presentation called Embracing the Three Harmonies. That link is there. I know you won't get it at the moment, but it'll be there in the PDF. And in that presentation, I looked at the three harmonies as a constellation of ideas, as a vision, as a practice, and as a tool. This time, we're going to be looking at it as a strategy. So it has some partial precursors in various moral systems, but from my sense, there isn't anybody who really pulls it together out of that past, because it's really designed for what's happening now and what's emerging. So it's new as a whole and in its details. And it really focuses on win, win, win. So what do I mean by that? You win, the other wins, and the context wins. So it's very much of a system orientation, looking for what is the system solution that will provide benefits in many different ways. And that winds up being more sustainable than something that is focused on win-lose. It uses mind and heart and will in a mutually supportive combination. So the dominator strategy is really focused on will. And one of the things I talked about in the last presentation was that the problem was with many of these things out of the Age of Enlightenment and further back also is their monopolies. So it isn't that will is a problem, it's the monopoly of will that winds up being a problem. And the three harmonies treats the other as a territory worthy of empathy and respect. And that's whether you're talking about nature or other people. So it's a different kind of relationship. And it's smart in today's highly connected world. It may seem more emotionally appealing to you, but in the past, it hasn't risen to the point where it had enough support in its surroundings to be really the smart approach. And what I would suggest to you is we are at a tipping point. We're in the tipping zone right now. We're in a transition time, going from a time when the three dominations was the smart way to go, and increasingly the three harmonies will be. So I just want to remind you, and my experience is that many people don't fully get the degree to which the world we are in now is dramatically different from the world of a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago. Here are just some of the ways that it's different. This is a chart of population. And of course, the population is now hugely bigger than it was. By the way, if we were to lose 90% of the world's population, we would be back to where we were about in 1700. And in 1700, that was the highest population the world had ever had, to just give you a sense of how different the populations are. But it's not just numbers. We crossed the threshold back in about 1970, where we crossed the Earth's carrying capacity if we were doing things with business as usual. So how are we going to be adept at the new strategy? I'm going to look at that in three levels, looking at it from the perspective of yourself, and then in groups, and then for the culture. And this, I draw on this diagram that is in that embracing the three harmonies, looking at embodying the harmony within, with others, and with nature, on three levels, for yourself, in small groups, and to benefit the culture. So I'm going to carry through with that and look at those three levels. And in each one of those levels, we're going to look at how the old strategy works, ways the old strategy doesn't work, what's different now, and what's the new strategy. Okay, so for yourself. In the old strategy, which was enforce the domination over self, it's oriented to a life of power struggles and accentuates qualities that go with the fight response in the autonomic nervous system, and then turns them into habits. And what could we possibly mean by domination over self? What we're doing really is using focus and self-discipline and suppression of feelings and empathy. So it's the domination over a significant portion of who we are as humans. And it makes the conscious will the ruler of your life. But of course, being savvy about psychodynamics, we know that the conscious will floats on top of all of that unconscious processing that goes on and is not nearly as sovereign as it thinks it is. So success here is the capacity to win power struggles. That's what you're focused on. Ways this doesn't work. Well, it locks you into your defensive zone, which cuts you off from all those good optimal zone qualities like creativity, compassion, and joy. It narrows your mind and cuts you off from the wisdom of heart and body, and it exhausts your body. I think of those as significant downsides. Up to you as to whether or not you do, but I do. So what's different now? We have a much better understanding of psychodynamics that allows us to work with the full complexity of who we are, rather than feeling that we need to control it, that it's this wild beast that we need to somehow get a firm grip on. Through neuroscience, trauma healing therapies, and our ability to tap into wisdom traditions from all over the world, the combination of all of these things now is incredibly fruitful. And it's really only in the last few decades that those have emerged. And the culture takes time to catch up. But that doesn't mean we can't be at the leading edge of that catching up. Also, we're in a highly interconnected world that requires optimal zone skills like creativity, collaboration, and compassion. Plus, you aren't losing things like focus and self-discipline and courage, and all of those are part of the optimal zone toolkit just as well. You don't need to be in your defensive zone in order to experience those. In fact, you can do a better job with them when you're in your optimal zone. So what's the new strategy for embodying the three harmonies for yourself through? Well, optimal zone living is both the destination and the process. But to do that well, we need optimal zone resilience. We need to be able to diffuse our emotional landmines, update our beliefs, and learn new skills. And these last three, I would go back to this diagram that I think I shared in the Savvy About Psychodynamics, about the way in which developmental trauma comes in. And it's really in being able to process the emotional landmines, the limiting beliefs, and the missing skills that we are able to really change our defensive patterns. So what's some example of that? Again, this is from the Savvy About Psychodynamics, and the idea that our sort of default mode when we are in our defensive zone and have gotten triggered is that we try to reduce the level of external threat as our first attempt at what we do. That makes sense if the threat is very immediate and physical, but most of the things that we react to aren't. And so we can train ourselves to instead do some kind of optimal zone resilience practice when we feel triggered, so that we can move more into our optimal zone and have more capacity to deal with whatever the issue is that wound up triggering us. And I just want to go, I'm again going to go back to, you think I'm a broken record around this, but it's such an easy yet effective way to tie into optimal zone resilience. So the neurological reset. Tell yourself in the moment, I'm physically safe. And you're really telling your amygdala, in the moment, I am physically safe. Reassure yourself of that. And then provide yourself with a gentle self-hug. And while you're doing that self-hug, do these next things 3 times. Lift your cheeks and wiggle your nose. What you're doing with that is you're stimulating the upper parasympathetic nervous system. Breathe comfortably in through your nose, and then breathe out more slowly through your mouth. It's as simple as that. I really recommend that you do it. Next time you feel a little agitated, a little anxious, just try it. I also want to, relative to working with the landmines and the beliefs and the skills, I want to share something that I think is a wonderful example of what I think is really just at the leading edge of things that are going to be, we're going to get a lot more of. So I'm going to share with you about it's a particular program that has an app connected with it, emotional brain training, that I like what they do. I wouldn't be sharing this if I didn't, but this is not really a commercial for this app, and I don't have any financial connection to them. But I just think it's a nice illustration. of memory reconsolidation, which is this wonderful coming together of neuroscience and therapy experience to figure out how we can really reconfigure memories so that we retain the learning, but remove the triggering. So this app leads you through a whole series of steps. And I'm going to give you what those steps are. And the titles at the top are my titles, but the bullet points are their text. So it starts you off with a series of, breathing, adjusting your posture, feeling warm thoughts towards yourself. All of these things are boosting your connection to your optimal zone. So they put you there as a starting point. But then they ask you to bring up some situation that's bothering you, that's stressing you, and to name the situation and also name what it is that's stressing you the most about that situation. So you really connect with what that situation is. And then you really get into it. You talk about how you feel angry, how you just can't stand it, how you hate it. The encouragement is to just really let it rip in terms of how you feel about that situation. And what you're doing when you do that is you're really energizing that whole memory with all of its emotional stuff around it. You're also, they wouldn't describe it this way, but I would, you are relating to that situation as an object, as a singular object with one set of emotional characteristics to it. But then after you've gone through that intensity, next they ask you to look at some other feelings that you may have about that situation. I feel sad that, I feel afraid that, I feel guilty that, what was my role in that situation? And so now we're broadening out a little more. And then they go even further and ask you to look at, well, in this situation, is there anything that you can feel grateful for? Is there anything that you can feel happy about or secure about or even proud about? And by the time you've gone through all that, you've converted what was a situational emotional object into a situational territory, which has a lot of different emotional components to it. And as that sinks back into your memory, it will overwrite the memory that was there before and do a lot to change the triggering around it. Okay, let's look at how all this works in small groups. The old way, enforce the domination over others. You get the picture. It works by concentrating resources at the top. And then you have command and control from the top. And from that top, you distribute both patronage and violence. You have both a bribe and a threat. And it depends upon what kind of organization you're in as to what degree there's, physical violence. As you go down, it's really obvious if you go back 1,000 years about how down at the level of the slaves and the serfs, the violence was pretty obvious. It isn't necessarily so obvious in a company, but we have it in subtler forms in terms of making it really clear that being unemployed is not very fun. And so, and it's important for the whole system to continue to make sure there's nothing like a guaranteed income or anything like that that would make it okay to not be employed, because you got to, if you're going to maintain these hierarchies, you got to have this pressure at the bottom. Patronage also winds up, it's a bribe, but it also has a threat embedded in it because you don't get it by right. You get it because somebody grants it to you, and that same person who granted it to you can pull it out from under you in a moment. And then you fall down the hierarchy. In order for it to work, it depends upon low mobility. People need to be stuck. Otherwise, they'd walk away. And also limited horizontal communications, because otherwise people would organize. That's part of why it worked so brilliantly in the agrarian empires, where people were tied to the land. You know, if you were a farmer on the land, you were tied there. You were illiterate. You didn't really have much in the way of any means of communicating with people beyond the next village. And even there, they didn't trust you. So there was a lot in the agrarian empires that made it easy to do this kind of thing. And so success means establishing and maintaining control and concentration of those resources. So what's the problem here? Well, it's often traumatizing for everyone, including the people at the top, who wind up having to, well, it's dehumanizing for everybody. Let me just put it that way. It makes incredibly poor use of the distributed intelligence in the group by trying to maintain control at the top. And this is one of the reasons that the centralized economies in the old Soviet empire really didn't work well, is it didn't matter how brilliant the people at the center were, they were still making very poor use of all of the intelligence in the rest of the system. And it suppresses creativity and commitment, all of which are really needed in today's groups. So what's different now? And when I say different now, I want to say different compared to what it was a few hundred years ago, especially different than what it was a few thousand years ago. Not so much different now compared to last week. You know, it's a somewhat longer time frame to look at. So literacy and education and quality of life are all significantly higher than they were just a few hundred years ago. Peer-to-peer communication is incredibly easier than it was just a few decades ago. Mobility is easier, actually all over the world at this point. And optimal zone qualities are much more valuable. They're valuable in the marketplace. The creativity, the ability to collaborate, all of those things are much more valuable. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is one of those things about the last few hundred years that I think everybody should know. And that is that we basically did a flip in these last 200 years, from a time when the literacy around the world was like 12%, to where the illiteracy around the world is like 15%. That's an incredible change in the capacity of the bulk of humanity. And in a similar way, a similar flip, 200 years ago, and what's extreme poverty? Extreme poverty is living on the edge of starvation, basically, you know, really close to starving. 200 years ago, 94% of the world was there. Now it's down to about 10%. We need to get rid of that last 10%, but it is a huge change in the quality of life for the average human. I think we've often failed to realize how awful life was, not only a few hundred years ago, but 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, for the vast bulk of humanity. What we have available to us from those times is the lives of the elite. So what's the new strategy for embodying the three harmonies in groups through shared optimal zone living? The more that groups can share optimal zone living, the more groups, you know, it's just easier in all kinds of different ways. Group optimal zone resilience, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Group creativity supported by those diverse modes of cognition. This is where they really come into their own. And the synergy of agency and alignment. I credit Chuck Peters with this phrase, and I think it's a wonderful description of what we need to be able to do in our groups going forward. So, group optimal zone resilience, what does that mean? In a group, it's really helpful if you can share the concepts, even the concepts of optimal zone in the group. And even better if you can share simple practices like the neurological reset. And then practice what I'm going to call optimal zone first aid before you need it. So that as the group recognizes that it's normal for people to get triggered at some point, at some time, what are we going to do? How many times have you been in a group where somebody got triggered and everybody else went, ah, had no clue as to what to do because there was no preparation for it. And yet it's like, we know it's coming. And then use it when somebody gets triggered. They're wonderful, simple things that you can do to set the expectations, create the conditions. It gets normalized. Everybody is respected in the process. The signal that was involved and whatever it was that got somebody triggered gets captured, but you don't work on it until everybody's back in their optimal zone. And then support creativity. Become skillful with what's known as design thinking. And for me, the key with design thinking is that you're looking for a solution that's better than anybody brought with them when they walked into the room. And you want to support that with visual and kinesthetic thinking and expand that creativity with optimal zone intuition and somatic awareness, all things that I talked about last week. Okay, synergy of agency and alignment. You need to create a community of mutual support and open communication, and then align not around a person, but align around shared vision and intention. If needed, and this is a place where I think that hierarchy can be very helpful, create a nested hierarchy of visions that everybody can contribute to. And the nested visions, the largest one is the broadest vision. And then as they nest in, they deal with more specific things that need to be illuminated. And then once you're there, trust people to do their best once they're aligned with a vision and understand what it is, how their piece fits into the whole. So I feel there's this huge opportunity at this point for new work groups that embody the three harmonies with the help of the three capacities: psychodynamics, cognition, and strategy for success, to become wonderful and unusually productive places to work. And I want to say that if you are part of a work group that would like consulting help to do this, please contact me. That's whether you're on this call or watching this. You can go to context.org and do a contact message. I'd be delighted to talk with you and see what might be possible. Okay, to benefit the culture. The old strategy was, again, enforce the domination over others in nature. Pretty simple strategy. Grab the center of power, impose your will. And success means being a ruler. And this was true back in the agrarian empires. It's also true in the 20th century revolutions that occurred. Very similar kind of orientation towards how to make changes. Most of the time, people were interested in simply changing who held the power. but not so much making cultural change. If you're really interested in making cultural change, however, there are a lot of downsides to try to make cultural change through this kind of domination approach. Cultures are complex adaptive systems, not machines, and they change in more complicated ways. I was quite involved in the former Soviet Union during the 1980s with what was known as citizen diplomacy at that point. Really got a feel for the culture that was there and for the history. And it is remarkable to me how much continuity there is between Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, and Putin's Russia. Culture is incredibly powerful. Power grabs create a lot of trauma and provoke a lot of ongoing resistance. They just put a lot of grit in the works. If you're really trying to generate cultural change, this is not helpful. And a lot of your energy is going to go into ongoing power struggles. If you're really interested in cultural change, again. So what's different now? Well, all of those differences that I noted before, and the higher level of interdependence among societies and with nature in today's ecologically full and communication small world. Just want to also put this in here, the ecological footprint. Again, around 1970, we crossed the Earth's biocapacity for sustainable capacity. I haven't updated this in a few years, but I'm sure it's grown even more. It used to be that you didn't really need to worry about nature other than in your local environment because it was so huge compared to human activity. We no longer have that luxury. And here, in terms of interconnectedness, this is the percent of the world's population using the internet. It's in 2019, it was over 50% of the world's population. And that's world's population, including children and old people. And I mean, it's just, and this is in a space of 30 years. Relative to worldwide cultural changes, this is, I mean, this is jaw-dropping to make that much change that quickly. And you can be sure we have not even begun to absorb the implications of this yet. So how can we help the culture embody the three harmonies? We do this through being cultural co-evolvers, as in my presentation to the Stoa in August. Innovating, implementing, communicating. Again, from that. Being savvy about psychodynamics with the people that we're working with. And using diverse modes of cognition in our communication. And focusing your efforts strategically. So let me go a little bit into some of these. So with being a co-evolver, really understand that culture is an evolving, complex, adaptive system. Don't fight it, work with it. Have a clear sense of direction, but don't fixate too much on outcomes because the whole context around you is going to continue to evolve. New possibilities will continue to emerge. And in that process, keep prototyping and iterating. In terms of innovate, implement, communicate, I'm a fan of Buckminster Fuller here, where he says you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. For me, that's the real driver of cultural change. It may not make news, but it makes history. So with that, you get things spreading by this diffusion of innovations, where the different groups, as it moves, as the adoption moves along the diffusion curve. It's also really important to, in terms of the psychodynamics, to understand the motivations in your audience. I would say right now, this is going to be a US-centric comment, but in US politics, where the Democrats tend to be the Age of Enlightenment idealists, and the Republicans tend to be the Empire era reactionaries, if you will. They're the ones who are still really committed to the domination strategy. Those are gross generalizations. My apologies to anybody who's offended by them. But one of the things that's been characteristic for the Democrats is their inability to really understand the psychodynamics of the people that they should be communicating to, because they're caught up in Age of Enlightenment idealism. Find resonant modes of cognition to connect with whoever it is that you're trying to communicate with. Understand the other as a territory, as a whole being. And then use this, if you're really interested in cultural change, use the strategy of water and flow around the rocks. What do I mean by that? Don't put your effort into the people who are just totally resistant. Voluntary adoption. That is, find the people who are interested in adopting whatever it is that you're trying to spread, and help spread it through voluntary adoption. Lasts longer and generates less resistance. Now you may say, but not everything can be done that way. Yes, I mean, it's true that not everything can be done that way. But if you look at systems in a broad sense, you almost always find things in the surround of any rock where you can make changes, and over time, it will affect the rock. So what is it in all this that's truly yours to do? Which is one of the questions that I think is important if you want to be strategic. And I would encourage you to look for something that you care about, because you need something that's going to motivate you and carry you through. But also find something that's within your sphere of agency, something that you can affect. Don't try to don't try to leap too far out beyond what you can really reach. Although often people can reach further than they believe they can. And then something that spreads the three harmonies. And when you find something that matches all those three, that for me is the sweet spot of the topic that should draw your energies. But it's also a question of where are you on the curve, because the strategies for what you do as you move along the curve change. At the very beginning of the diffusion curve, you got experimentation, innovation, all of that stuff happening. Then you kind of move on to pilot projects. And once the pilot projects are working pretty well, you need to build support systems. Because if you don't have the support systems, you'll just get ideas out there. But that's not really totally what you need with the popularization. You need infrastructure. Then you can move on to popularization. Don't do it too quick. Back in the 1970s, there was much too rapid popularization around rooftop solar hot water systems. There was not the infrastructure to support it. People put up poor systems that leaked and destroyed people's roofs and all this sort of thing. And it wound up vaccinating a whole generation against the idea of rooftop solar. Eventually, electoral politics may come in. I'm a fan of don't do electoral politics until you're close to the majority, until it's something where you can potentially win. And you may not need to do it at all. Much of cultural change doesn't involve electoral or governmental activity in any significant way. And the same is true with regulation. It may be needed to sweep up the laggards, but may not. All right. So what are some takeaways out of all this? I just want to kind of, in a sense, repeat what I see as the strategies. So for yourself, through optimal zone living, optimal zone resilience, diffusing your emotional landmines, updating your beliefs and learning new skills for yourself. In groups, shared optimal zone living, group optimal zone resilience, that optimal zone first aid, group creativity. And I really, this is intentionally in a sequence. If you aren't able to manage group optimal zone living, your creativity is really going to be diminished. So I think job one is get the group into their optimal zone. And then you can move into whatever problem solving, et cetera, that you need to do. And then figure out that synergy of agency and alignment. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on these days with reinventing organizations and the whole, not just that particular stream, but other things of that sort. A lot of it is looking at how to change structures. That's good, but unless you also are savvy about psychodynamics, you can't get nearly as far. And then for the culture, be a cultural co-evolver, innovating, implementing, communicating, being savvy about psychodynamics, use your diverse modes of cognition, and focus your efforts strategically. We need to have people moving on 1,000 different cultural fronts all at the same time, because that's the way a complex adaptive system evolves. It isn't through one magic bullet. It's through moving on all kinds of different places. So it's fine if you are drawn to something that other people say, well, that's not, how will that solve climate change? Well, maybe your calling, maybe your piece in the world is to actually work on something that 10 years from now, people will say, oh, I'm so glad you did that. Coming up, we've got this in a week. No more presentations from me. We'll just have open conversation that I'm definitely looking forward to. And then I also want to let you know that if you want to go deeper with this, really encourage you to take a look at Bright Future Now. The next course, there's just one space that's still available for it. We have a maximum of 21 people in each cohort so that we can keep it human scale. And so there's that one space. First one to take it, it's gone. And registration will end on December 18th, but I suspect it's going to end sooner than that. And you'll find everything you need about that at context.org. Now that we're at the end of this threesome of presentations, I really want to say thank you to all of you who have been part of this and paying attention to it. I thank you, and who knows, maybe Gaia thanks you as well. All right.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. So into the Q&A now. For those who may have questions that they want to ask Robert, I would encourage you to put it into the chat. If you would like to not have it be recorded onto YouTube, you can indicate in the chat that you would like me to speak it on your behalf. I will start us off, and I hope I can do a good articulation here, which is something that I am actively learning is in relation to how there can be a tendency to often think about these things as over there, or I'm going to do it over there, or set up the circumstances so that I can then do it. Whereas there can be a kind of change in perspective to recognize how we are already deeply doing it. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about the three harmonies, I feel like, we right now on this call, from Robert's perspective, can have Robert as the individual, us here mm-hmm. as a group, and then kind of the larger, say, our little corner of the noosphere that we are occupying and influencing the culture in who knows what mysterious ways. Would you comment a little bit in terms of how you think about that being present amongst us right now?
Oh, yes. I think, first of all, one of the things that gives me, that really nourishes me, is the degree to which so many people are doing things that are increasing their capacity to embody the three harmonies. And it's just, that to me is just as much a part of the news of the planet as what we see in the media. And in fact, in the longer term, it may be even more so. And what we do in these conversations feels, yes, it's all part of that stream of the way in which we are deepening our embodiment of the three harmonies. And it's important that, for me, that you have to live into embodiment. It's not something that, you hear about it, you read about it, you get it, you know the answer to give on the test, and you're done. Check. No, that's not the way it works. It's a matter of really developing it as something that's practice, and you just keep going with it. It's kind of like there's always more depth to be gained. And it's self-nourishing. One of the things I thought about but didn't put in is that in the contrast between the two, that often enforce the three dominations involves a certain amount of personal sacrifice. Embodying the three harmonies is self-nourishing. The most you have to give up is some of your baggage, maybe. But that's, I think as you look back on it, it was not a loss to give it up. So anyway, those are my ramblings on that one.
Cool. There's already questions in the chat, so I will pass it off to Max. Max, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Robert. First, I would like to really acknowledge your work. It's one of the most comprehensive, big picture and constructive visions that I've seen around, even though, it may not be super popular. And I'm talking about your work on Vimeo as well, about a bright future. And so, yeah. So my question is that it seems that it is difficult for distributed groups to have a coherent direction and concerted action, whereas a clear chain of command seems most effective for emergencies, and so why it might be used in armies. But given the ecological challenges at hand, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be easier to have a most competent yet non-coercive authority that will make decisive action while aiming to respect individual sovereignty?
So that's a great holy grail to, how do we pull all those things off has been a big human challenge. And I think there, it's not like there is one answer. I'm not, how do I put this? There's a concept that I like to use called categorical reversal, and it's something that you actually want to avoid. So if you've had difficult experiences with hierarchies, then the categorical reversal to say is, let's throw them all out. Let's do it completely flat. We'll just have no hierarchy. But that has its problems as well. What, for me, the subtler point is that when the problems with hierarchies come from power over hierarchies, come from those, and it's why I've chosen to focus on the term dominator as the issue. If my house is on fire, I want the fire chief and the firefighters to be a well-trained team, and I want the fire chief to be directing things in that kind of emergency. But I presume that they've all worked it through and they all consent to that. there are emergency situations where we need that kind of structure and coordination. But I think that, there's this concept of servant leader. I would like to add to that the concept of steward leader, someone who really stewards whatever it is that is their sphere of influence, if you will. I think to the extent that you can have a hierarchy of visions where people have bought into whatever those chunks of vision are, and then are empowered to act within those, that can accomplish in a more, how do I say it? In a more nuanced way and in a more light on its feet way, what would otherwise be done through too much of a bureaucratic hierarchical structure. But to the extent that people are struggling with because of their traumas around working with authority figures, if they're bringing a lot of that trauma into whatever the collaborative situation is, then it makes it really difficult to get the useful operational hierarchies that often need to be there, which is why for me, the key often is really being able to deal with those psychodynamics. And that unless you're able to deal with the psychodynamics, merely structural changes are going to keep being disappointing. And there's a lot of energy that I see in the decentralized organization stuff that grows out of that reaction. And until we can really get on the other side of that, I don't think we can really grasp the full potential of new ways to organize ourselves.
Any follow-up on that? Any follow-up you'd like to have, Max?
Yeah, I'm just curious how could this, firefighting squad could come into being with the, amount of all the multitude of voices around, but as well as Professor Pinot put a comment, it's like we not only need firefighters, but builders,
Mhm.
like how will we find them and put them together?
Well, fortunately, in a complex adaptive system, we don't have to solve it all. So I don't mean to put off your question that way, but I think that we solve it by doing it. We solve it by getting in and working on whatever piece of agency you have. And then it is, and my experience is that when I do that, other things open up. And I discovered that there are other people working in parallel that I had no clue about that are doing really great things. So I can't remember the appropriate Goethe quote, but there's a power in doing it. There's a power in stepping in and just going for it with what you feel called to. For me, the mystery let me be a little esoteric here and say that I don't think we're quite as skin encapsulated egos, separate consciousnesses as we imagine ourselves to be. I think we are in a little bit more intercommunication at a consciousness level than our culture realizes. And part of doing that dance is being willing to do what you feel called to in a way that you realize you can't see the whole big picture and you have to trust. But if more people would release their energy and do that, I think we would move faster.
Cool. I got a question that I will read on their behalf. So it goes, so I noticed that you have not included talked about indigenous people in your mapping of world history, i.e. in the 3 dominations and 3 harmonies. The 3 harmonies sounds like a description of indigenous values and practices, and I'd love to understand your thinking on this.
Yeah, so I talk about indigenous in the people more in when I do the historical stuff, and for me I don't want to, how do I say this? It's complicated, but I have a lot of respect for the wisdom in indigenous cultures. And I think they were able to put the pieces together for their context really well. Plus the ones that are still around have, there was a selection effect that I think means that there's especially wisdom in the ones that are still around. I don't feel that that the path forward is simply to go back to being indigenous in that sense. Actually, yes, it is. We should all recognize we are all indigenous on Gaia, but not in the sense that indigenous is usually used. But I think that it's that the indigenous wisdom is an important part of what we need to now bring into and draw on for all this.
Cool. I'd like to sort of expand in the direction of culture a little bit here, where I remember seeing some statistics somewhere about how 40% of U.S. citizens have not gone past their states, or something like that, and culture feels very much like the water that the fish swims in, so to speak, and it can be really difficult to perceive. Never mind talk, saliently about. And so I'm wondering how, when you're talking about citizen diplomacy, one of the power of that is to recognize, although we are, within the cultural platform, shall we say, of the empire era, there are still differences that help perceive, oh, hey, your water seems a little different than mine. That can give me a little more perceptibility of the fact that we are even in water at all. And so, yeah, something like that, Linnea. Some substantial portion of people apparently have not traveled outside of their state. And so I'm curious, Robert, how you think about, because the solution doesn't quite seem to me like, cool, let's make it mandatory that everybody have to travel at least one country outside of their continent. That doesn't exactly seem like the type of solutioning that makes sense here. And so how do you think about the practice of, I suppose, cultural literacy in how we can better perceive the water that we swim in, that gives us the kind of agency to even think about the fact that we have this relationship with the culture that's or mutually causal? Yeah,
well, and we, I blithely talk about culture, but there are all these overlapping subcultures, and the mosaic is pretty. And it's not just mosaic because they overlap in geography, and it's all pretty intense in terms of that diversity and the way in which you have some people who are really encapsulated in particular cultures. My sense is that one of the effects of that growing internet connection process is that if you look age-wise, if you look generationally, I'd be really fascinated to see what is the age profile of those 40 or 47% people who haven't been out of their state. My guess is that some of them will be very young, because young children don't necessarily travel all that much. But and I think it would also be interesting to ask how many people have some kind of friend relationship that's geographically distant. One of my granddaughters who's 16 at this point. Of course, part of what's happened with COVID is that she has these sort of two clusters of friends. One is within walking distance and the other is all over the globe. And so for me, that rather than trying to force that in a uniform way, I think the thing to do is to look at, so how do you make that easier? How do you speed up the process of those connections, whether it's physical travel or other things? Are there places in this, with what's happening now, are there places where there are constraints that could be opened up a little bit more? But also for those of us who have had the benefit, share it. You know, it's important for us to communicate where we can outside of our usual circles.
Cool. I'd love to then invite Renee to ask their question, where another layer of how we stay interconnected with the larger culture is the economic layer.
Mm-hmm.
Renee, would you like to ask your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thinking about value exchange
Mm-hmm.
and capital, we've done that throughout the ages in very different ways. Initially, it was really tangible. It was physical products exchange. And then in the economics, we had the gold standards, and now we let that loose, and it was based on the economy of a nation and so on. And we now see also digital currencies and microfinance. So how would you imagine the sort of value exchange in living the three harmonies? Because for instance, philanthropy is sort of a command and control way of value exchange with a very, very long delay. And markets is a competitive way of doing it, mm-hmm. Exchange markets. So how would you see that? And would that be some sort of maybe supporting structure also for living the three harmonies?
Yeah, so I don't see that the three harmonies necessarily makes the market go away. I think the market, for me, the market's going to be here with us for a long time. If I was going to make any kind of modification in the market, it would be a much better pricing system where we didn't have externalities. And, you know, if we really had if we were really including everything that we should be in the pricing system, then the pricing in the marketplace would give us good information. It doesn't right now. However, I want to say that's transactional exchange, and it's, you know, it's kind of limited. You know, you give this, they give that, and done. There's another kind of economy that has gotten, it used to be really big, and that I think is going to re-increase and maybe does connect with, how do I say this? The three harmonies make it easier. It's not like the three harmonies is this separate thing that will have its own separate economy. The three harmonies infuses throughout all of the various different aspects. But there's what I would describe as community-based economy, which is where you are part of a community where you have some sense of ongoing participation in that community, and you understand that the community has a commons to it. And so you are willing to invest into that community. And others have a sense of what you are doing in terms of contributing in, even though there's no exact bookkeeping that happens. You know, I'm one of the places I'm happily connected to at this point is northern Senegal, which is on the southern edge of the Sahara, incredibly difficult conditions. But people live there. And in those communities where they're growing their own food, et cetera, and have long histories with each other, you know, people know what you do. They know how contributive you are into the community. And so even though there isn't a direct accounting kept, there is some awareness that is kept. And I think that we're going to have more of that. It's not quite what is sometimes described as, well, it's sometimes described as the love economy, but it isn't only that. And it's certainly not the gift economy. We see it on a small scale within households, but in a lot of modern Western cultures, we've been sufficiently pulled out of any kind of community. We have networks, but we don't have a sense of community, so that we've lost that. I think the greater level of safety and inner trust that comes with living in your optimal zone is going to make it much more possible for people to invest in the commons where they see the commons happening.
Would you think it's something similar to Eleanor Ostrom's common pool resources?
I don't know them well enough to say.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
And good to connect with you this way, Renee.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Rosa, you have a question.
Yeah, so this is kind of veering in a different direction, but kind of back to the question of Indigenous people as, so this is not about Indigenous people, but it's about women. You had mentioned something about a moral theory, and I'm just really curious about where you see the ethics of care as fitting into your model.
Yeah. Well, sure. Let me fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So I'm about to do this and talk gender. But historically, of course, that the dominator model had men above women. It didn't mean that women didn't in some ways participate in that dominator strategy, but it was a heavily male-oriented strategy. And in that process, culturally, and these are gross generalizations, but culturally, women were supported to develop more harmonizer skills. So there are a lot of ways in which the tradition in women's culture is ahead of the game on all that. Guys, we have a lot to learn. We always knew that, but still, and so I think, yes, the caring will come into this. I think it does. There is that side also, Rosa, you'll understand what I'm saying with this. There is the side of being aware of compensated pulling and the drift of caring into something that has its trauma-related aspects to it, and also the ways in which, well, no, let me just say that. So with one of the places where the shift out of the dominator model to the three harmonies model, to my mind, is showing up first is in intimate relationships. Now, it hasn't shown up universally there. That's not what I'm saying, but it is a place where probably for most of the people on this call would be appalled at what the expectations were 100 years ago for what should be the male-female relationship in a marriage, for instance. And it doesn't surprise me that it shows up first at that intimate level. I think the next scale is going to be business. And I think it may take a while before it ripples all the way out to really large institutions, including governments.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, I think it's an important dimension, right? There's the self, there's the group, and there's the culture. And I do think that the interpersonal is also important. So thank you.
Yeah. I struggle with what to do in less than an hour.
I'd love to expand on that a little bit. It's a topic I care a lot about as well. And I really appreciate how you kind of contextualized this topic with the phrase "where angels fear to tread," insofar as, in my experience, it very much requires a deep practice of the optimal zone to really effectively step into productive, generative conversations in this realm. And so, bring what Rosa just talked about in the interpersonal side of things, I'd love to offer myself up as a case study here and kind of make it more specific or personal in a way where, you know, you and I, Robert, technically represent an older generation man and a younger generation man. In the context of thinking about, you know, the domination versus the harmonies, how would you advise someone like me in relation to our roles that we can play in this masculine feminine dynamic?
Listen, in terms of the two of us being same gender, different age, part of the way that I see you is I have no clue as to what your deep incarnational history is. Just because your particular body this time happened to show up years after mine did may not mean an awful lot at a level of wisdom. Well, who knows? But I need to really be in touch with you rather than the age category that I can put you in. And in terms of, well, let me see. Let me throw it back to you at this point, David, and say, I'm not sure. I have the sense that there's somewhere else that we might go with this, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So I want to get your guidance as to what that might be.
I would certainly participate however I can, though I'm not quite sure if you're making a request of some kind, and if so, I'm not quite clear on what that would be.
Right, I'm being too obscure. Yeah, I'm making a request. Where would you like? I feel like I've only partly stepped into the territory of the topic that you initiated. So is there more to that topic that you'd like to help me better understand?
Yeah. Well, I think so. To really simplify things, even to help my own thinking flow, there are women in my life. I think there are women in your life. There are these structural patterned challenges in relation to how we relate with other men and other women, and, well, biological sex aside, the entire gender spectrum. I imagine that you have had thoughts in relation to the patterns that show up, because as far as I can tell, this masculine and feminine thing shows up not only to different genders, but of the same gender as well. And it is very much of my personal interest that I'm going to essentially make a stake or stake a claim that it is relevant enough to others as well, that Robert could potentially comment a bit on how he thinks about the relationship to gender in an interpersonal way that could use me as a potential example. Does that help clarify?
All right, so part of what goes on for me is that one of the things that we actually use in Bright Future Now, and that has been important to me for like 25 years, has been this process of understanding character styles in terms of 5 different patterns. And so it isn't just masculine, feminine, but the 5 different patterns that do show up in slightly different ways in terms of men and women in those 5 patterns. So this is hard because the people on this call don't all know what those patterns are. So I can't really communicate through those. It's also something that I think that I can say is that another thing that we make use of is to really look at ourselves as territories, and in that process, see ourselves as complex territories with a lot of subpersonalities, a subpersonality being a pattern, a personality pattern that shows up in a particular context. So it isn't just that I'm a particular male and have this set of characteristics. I have this set of characteristics when I'm in conversation with you, David. I have another set of characteristics when I'm in conversation with my wife, Liana. I have a different set of characteristics when I'm in conversation with who knows who. So with all of those, it's how do I say this? I'm really reluctant to get into characterizing maleness and femaleness per se, because I think it's so diverse. At the same time, I think it's hugely important that we don't just carry forward the historical images of maleness and femaleness. It's one of the reasons why I talk about dominator instead of talking about patriarchy, because if you talk about patriarchy, you're genderizing it in a way that I think is not helpful for us going forward. We need to understand what those dynamics were, but we need new senses of the feminine, new senses of the masculine, new senses of the way that those show up in each of us. Because it's, it's an ecology, it works together. And we definitely need to be able to pull it forward somehow in all of us. That said, I think that for me personally, and this isn't not meant to be something generalizable, I just want to say for me personally, one of the things that has felt masculine in my life has been to be a keel, to be a place of stability for others in my intimate family and otherwise circles, to be able to be that keel in what might otherwise been stormy waters. But I don't want to say that that's something that should always be a masculine quality. And there's certainly, I can imagine it being done in a feminine way. And I can certainly know women who are fabulous keels as well. So it's, anyway, the angels are telling me to pay attention to what I'm doing.
I really appreciate your willingness to speak into as complex a subject as this. And I feel particularly, your last part particularly landed for me, insofar this is a personal case study for my kind of touching my soul in terms of how that actually lands. I'd love to, well, actually, there's about 2 minutes left. I'd love to see if there are anybody who has questions that they feel particularly called to. And to the extent that there isn't, I'd love to instead just invite you into potentially having some last words in terms of, well, this is now the end of your 3 presentation sessions. What would you like to share towards setting up for whether it's expectations or orientation for the next session, as well as how you may feel now that you have gone through this, at least the presentation portion of it. And given that there are no active questions that I am seeing, perhaps that's how we could close
Right.
this up.
Great, good. Well, I want to say thank you to Stoa and to all of the people who've been participating in these. I did my usual rash thing to say yes, and I'll do these 3 presentations, and it turned out to be more of a chunk of work than I necessarily thought I was going to be getting into, but a really helpful chunk of work for me. It helped me to think through and to create shareable material around some stuff that I really wanted to be able to get out. I'll acknowledge I'm relieved to have now completed this arc. And in terms of next week, my hope is that somehow or another we can take the seeds of the last 3 weeks, and in some sense the August presentation around the cultural co-evolver as well, and see what comes out of all that. It's, as you will gather, I have the sense that we as humanity are at this place where, as I like to say, we haven't been able to have this much fun for 5,000 years, that there is incredible opportunity here. And we get distracted away from being able to really move forward on these pieces. So everything that we can do to really build forward towards that planetary era, really build forward towards a place where more and more people are living in the 3 harmonies, just feels really juicy on the one hand. And if I knew what felt like a faster track to really deal with all of the polycrisis stuff, I'd be doing it. So with that as kind of, I mean, that's my heart song. That's my passion. And so what I would love is, what comes up for you with all that? What are your questions? Feel free to kick the tires. Part of my attitude towards all this is that whatever I put together is just my map, and it's all partial and selective and provisional. And I keep having places pointed out to me where there's something where I go back and say, oh, geez, why did I put it that way? So let's see what we can do to, how do I say it? There's something beautiful that wants to embody, that wants to incarnate through what we are all doing. How can we be midwives now to help that coming through in its next step forward?
Great. Thank you very much. And I think with that, we'll wrap up this session. And for those who are interested in more events on the Stoa, you can check out the stoa.ca. And I very much feel like these 3 presentations basically then add to the body of work that Robert has done in over the last decades, and form these kind of breadcrumb trails that people can find towards the process of transitions of eras. And so if you're interested in more of Robert's work, you can go to context.org. There's that one spot remaining in relation to the next cohort of the Bright Future Now network. And even if there wasn't, there's still a treasure trove of work that Robert has done in the past. And with that said, let's phase out. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. See you all hopefully next week.